Hi, Kevin. How are you today?
Good. How are you, Daniel?
I'm doing well. So, we've taken some time out of our day to have a conversation about statin drugs. They are heavily prescribed by many doctors, but I think that there's some misinformation floating around. And as you and I were discussing, there are a lot of statistics and pros and cons and different things like that floating around that are conflicting. So, we thought we would shed some light on this topic today. Do you want to take us through it? Take us through
Sure.
the science.
So basically, to begin with, the reasons statin drugs have arisen is out of the event where it's interpreted that cholesterol is more or less a negative factor for mammals. And I want to
Hmm.
clear that up. Cholesterol is vitally important for us. It is an integral part of our cellular membrane. It's a part of what makes our organs, glands. It's a major constituent of what makes us up. Cholesterol is basically, there's several definitions, and as many people know, like high density lipoproteins, low
Mm-hmm.
density lipoproteins, which by the
Right.
way are not cholesterol. A lipoprotein is, as the name suggests, a fat and a protein. They're
Mm.
spherical, and what they have receptor sites, and basically the receptor sites help propagate the mechanism of how it works. So cholesterol, quote unquote, or lipoproteins, we're going to be more specific with this,
Mm-hmm.
attach to cholesterol. And cholesterol is an important component of how we even generate steroids or hormones within our system. We rely
Okay.
on cholesterol. It's one of the beginning metabolic pathways of how hormones are produced, as an example.
Okay.
But the definition basically of a high density lipoprotein and a low density lipoprotein is the behavior in an aqueous solution. So a high density lipoprotein
Mm.
will sink where
High
a low,
density. It's gonna have,
exactly,
yeah.
and that's considered good. People consider high density lipoproteins favorable, where
Okay.
low density lipoproteins float.
Mm.
And this is assumed that this characteristic will behave and in a certain mechanism that can be either favorable or unfavorable. But Danielle, what's important is to summarize what basically the I'm not going to say fallacy, the misunderstanding that cholesterol is bad. Not bad.
No,
Cholesterol is a
right.
vital, important component within our cell membranes. It is vitally important. What what is misinterpreted is that basically the accumulation or the high amounts of lipoproteins, which is not
Mm.
cholesterol. I want to make
It's
sure we're
attaching
clear
to
on that.
cholesterol. So
Uh,
they're attaching to the, okay.
exactly, it's a component, or the cholesterol is a component of a
Okay.
lipoprotein.
Okay.
Basically, it is understood in most circles that cholesterol is negative, particularly high amounts, and we see this in lipid panels. We call it a lipid panel when we look at a blood test.
It's a test your doctor orders and they look at the
Exactly.
panel. Okay. And what are they looking at when they
They're
order a
looking at
panel?
the ratio generally of a low density lipoprotein to a high density
Okay.
lipoprotein.
Okay.
So I want to make sure we're clear on that.
Okay.
The really the unfavorable quote unquote fats are triglycerides.
Hmm.
And triglycerides are really the the uh, the substances, the
Mm-hmm.
fat itself. We'll just simplify that. They
Okay.
can basically do or induce damage to the arterial wall. So, and then we do further extrapolation and say, well, what are our serum calcium assays, and calcium that accumulates in the arterial wall, and the threat that that can induce as far as cardiovascular health. But getting back, I don't want to get too far off the subject.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Getting back to the idea that cholesterol is bad is really a misunderstanding. We need cholesterol. It is
Mm.
important for us. And
Mm-hmm.
having cholesterol in our system is vitally important for our health. So basically, that is something that is an integral, or
Mm-hmm.
I should say, a basic component of what keeps us healthy. Now,
Right.
let's talk about what statin drugs do.
Okay.
Statin drugs reduce or lower the activity of a coenzyme. It's called HMG reductase. And
Mm-hmm.
HMG reductase basically is a rate controlling enzyme that is dependent. We talked about this previous in a podcast to NAD or
Mm.
NADH.
Right. Okay.
And it's important to understand that this rate controlling enzyme is what synthesizes or helps synthesize the lipoprotein process. Now, what's interesting is, and we call it basically the pathway that produces cholesterol, so to speak, or terpenoids they're called. And I don't want to get too involved with that. But to make it short and sweet, it's important to understand by reducing HMG reductase, it reduces the total output of cholesterol.
Mm.
But
Hmm.
what this means
Yeah.
is it's also reducing the viable source that we require for,
Yeah.
organ
Right.
health.
For
Uh,
the good benefits of cholesterol.
exactly.
Right.
Now, and cell membrane integrity,
Right.
and we
Right.
can go on to side effects by taking statin drugs. I'm here only to talk about the science.
Yeah.
Now, there are some things that we use that are beneficial, but I'm going to use the analogy of a auto mechanic shop. You
Okay.
use the right tool for the right situation.
Right. Right.
Your car comes in, your car has, let's say the steering is out of alignment.
Mm-hmm.
We don't use, as an example, a sledgehammer and open the hood and start looking at messing around with the carburetor.
Yeah, exactly.
It's important to address the right situation with the right
Yes.
tool.
Right.
So, what is important about HMG reductase is that it is competitively suppressed. That's important to understand. What
Mm-hmm.
that means is, in mammals, it has a competitive nature to it, competitively suppressed. That's important in the cells. So what has happened to where that competitive nature is lost, and
Mm-hmm.
why we have a situation to where cholesterol, so to speak, can become out of hand. Now, there's several things
Mm.
that basically HMG reductase uh, is stimulated by, and one is glucose.
Mm.
Look at the correlation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Elevated amounts of glucose
Glucose, huh?
can translate into elevated activity of HMG reductase, which
Very
consequently
interesting.
produces more cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to remind I want to remind people here that it's triglycerides that are the pure enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about healthcare and cardiovascular problems, and when
Right.
we talk about triglycerides, that's pure fat in or sugar in, has pure fat out, or it's going to end up in the circulatory system.
Mm.
So, with this in mind, what I wanted to state is the use of statin drugs basically is, and I'm just proposing the question. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to say yes or no.
Yes.
Is it worth the risk of long-term statin use
Mm-hmm.
rather than dietary measures,
Mm-hmm.
rather than using as an example nicotinic acid, which
Mm-hmm.
has been favorable for many things when we talk about
Right.
lowering, the condition of having high elevated cholesterol in our system. The
Yeah.
question I'm proposing to people is, are statins worth the risk? The risk being shutting down or
Mm-hmm.
basically controlling or governing the rate limit of how cholesterol should be utilized within our bodies. And that
Right.
includes our organs, that
Mm-hmm.
includes cell membrane
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, integration and things like that. Is it worth it? That's the question I have for individuals. It
Especially
almost
when there, yeah, alternatives to simple alternatives
exactly,
to this problem.
exactly. And
Yeah.
we're not here to put blame on anyone for prescribing these things, because those are the tools that they're familiar with. But what we're
Mm-hmm.
here to do is to inform individuals that there are mechanisms that can be useful
Mm.
if one is concerned about triglycerides, which they should be, and
Right.
concerned about
Right.
lipoproteins, high
Right.
elevated lipoproteins.
Right. So let's break down triglycerides real quick. What causes high triglycerides for someone? Is that glucose, consuming fat, consuming saturated fat? I mean, is all of this, are these all parts of it, or are they kind of misinformation as well?
So basically, triglycerides are something that is so, I mean, generally, what happens is the fat in our system, the fat that we ingest from food,
Okay.
let's say dairy products,
Okay.
let's say even oils, polyunsaturates or monounsaturates, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only the fact that dietary oils can increase triglycerides, but also the excess amounts of calories that are ingested within the system.
Oh,
They
so
can
then
burn in.
a high caloric load. It
Exactly.
is does
Mhm.
that um and I'm thinking of an athlete who consumes 4,000 calories. I'm thinking of Michael Phelps, to be honest, the swimmer, who consumed an obscene amount of food while he was competitively swimming. So what you're talking about, though, is consuming high amount of calorie without the physical expenditure
Correct.
to balance it out. So someone who's active and eats a lot is going to have a much less risk of developing higher triglycerides than someone who is relatively sedentary and eats a lot of food, too many calories.
That is correct.
Okay.
So, and it depends on what foods they are. As an example, the high amounts of sugars,
Right.
that are
Right.
consumed. A glyceride basically is an ester, and I don't want to get too complex here, but the esters, glycerol is a sugar, and it's
Mm.
attached to fatty acid. So the more
Mm-hmm.
sugars that are consumed, the
Mm-hmm.
higher the probability that you're going to form high amounts of triglycerides. It's not just pure fat that
Right.
essentially
Right.
does it, because we have
Right.
to look at the biosynthesis of
Yeah.
triglycerides. It's
Correct.
basically glycerol. Yeah, triglycerides are glycerol and fatty acids. That
Mm-hmm.
hence the name.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, you know, so what happens is the greater the consumption of these types of things, like, as I mentioned before, fats and dairy and things like that, the
Mm-hmm.
greater the consumption of sugars, it's more likely to form higher amounts of triglycerides in our system.
Mm.
So now it's questionable, getting back to statin drugs, about are they really efficient over the long haul?
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this is important to understand. Do statin drugs basically address triglycerides? We know that when we ran our trials for ATP addressed both cholesterol or lipoproteins and triglycerides. But
Mm-hmm.
that is different. Our product is unique enough to where we have burned both triglycerides, fats, and we basically reduce the amount of lipoproteins that are produced, not
Mm.
in a way where we're shutting down HMG reductase. We're just literally
Right.
metabolizing it like a
Right.
hungry
Right.
child
It's a
eating food.
right. It's
And
a
that's the
completely different
difference.
mechanism. Right.
Exactly.
Right. It's almost
Exactly.
yeah.
So, to answer
Yeah.
your question, that basically is the process of what we look at when we look at blood fats, triglycerides,
Mm-hmm.
and lipoproteins. And lipoproteins, as many of us know, are generally the focus of many people as far
Yeah.
as cardiovascular risk, when indeed
Correct.
there's a
Right.
greater degree, or there's a greater opportunity to look at variables that can assist in this.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think of when someone brings you their blood panel and their triglycerides are high? What does that number look like for you? Like, what do you would
Above,
you consider?
okay, generally above 150 is
Okay.
considered high.
Okay.
I don't pay much attention to lipoproteins because
Mm-hmm.
I know what they do.
Yeah.
I think too many people are alarmed when they come in. They say, I have high lipoproteins. I go, don't worry about that. I want to look at your triglycerides.
Right.
If the
Right.
triglycerides are under 150, I
Mm-hmm.
generally don't pay much attention to it. Now, obviously, if their lipoprotein level is extremely high, 300 or 400,
Okay.
then there's an opportunity to say, well, listen, how do we look at, remember the competitive nature? We talked about that
Yes.
in mammals, and
Yeah.
how we look at the competitive nature. What increases lipoprotein production via HMG reductase can be the amount of, as I mentioned before, glucose. Glucose signals a higher amount or response activity of HMG reductase. And that's what's important to understand.
So that's really interesting because what you're saying, Billy, is that glucose is kind of it's kind of the it kind of is the culprit here. Too much
It's one
sugar is
it's one of the main causes. One of,
yeah.
we have the mevalonate pathway. The mevalonate pathway is a different response. I'm not going to get into that. It catalyzes the
Kevin, I'm
conversion.
gonna
Okay, so mevalonate pathway, the mevalonate pathway, I'm not going to get too much into that, but it catalyzes HMG reductase. But getting back to what is important to understand is what happens. What is the general function of a lipoprotein? That's the
mm-hmm.
first thing. The second thing is what happens when we reduce that production of a
Mm-hmm.
lipoprotein.
Right.
Something that is lipoproteins aren't new to mammals.
No.
Lipoproteins, we've evolved to need lipoproteins.
Mm.
And by shutting them down, shutting the synthesis down, what are we indeed doing? That's the
Right.
question I have for people
Right. Right. I
listening.
mean, yeah, again, you're altering the whole biochemical pathway in your body that has a whole cascade of events,
Mm,
not just the one narrowly defined component that's being promoted for these drugs.
exactly. So when we look at things like, we all know that diabetes, the incidence of diabetes is going up dramatically.
Right.
And
Right.
we look at the fact, as I mentioned before, that insulin and its antagonist glucagon
Mm-hmm.
basically they're meant to maintain glucose hemostasis. And if glucose is high, reductase activity will be high. And guess what's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen? It's going to
Right.
start to produce and synthesize more of the cholesterol. So the clinical significance is people that take a statin drug that lowers HMG reductase,
Mm-hmm.
basically by being on for the rest of their life, generally that's the case. I'm not saying all the time, but generally, you're dealing with side effects,
Mm-hmm.
muscular pain. We're seeing more correlation with dementia because guess what
Mm-hmm.
cholesterol does? It helps with the
Mm-hmm.
integrity of the brain.
Right.
Um,
Right.
we're seeing other factors where there are some signs that bone degeneration, osteopenia, osteomalacia
Mm.
are
Mm.
likely to increase with the use of statin drugs.
And
So,
why would that be?
because it's rate limiting step. So, what
Yeah.
happens is when you shut down HMG reductase,
Mm-hmm.
you lower the amount of pacing mechanisms on how cholesterol is meant to maintain certain conditions within our system.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Now, that also means it affects the pH. As we
Mm-hmm.
all know, when the pH begins to drop in our system, the parathyroid kicks in and says, I need to stabilize this somehow. We don't have
Right.
enough of the bicarbonate pool available. So our sources of magnesium, sodium, potassium that have been exhausted. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to grab the next potential electrolyte, and that's going to be calcium. Guess where
Mm.
calcium is going to be leached from?
The bone.
Bone, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can see these trails,
Again, right.
exactly, these trails
Huh.
that lead
Huh.
us to the fact of saying, let's reanalyze or let's revisit the use of statin drugs
Excuse
and
me.
what basically what they're doing to our system in the
Yeah.
long term. the
Yeah.
chronic use of a statin drug. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we have. Statin associated autoimmune
Mm.
myopathy is one thing that's big with the
Yeah.
use of statin drugs.
That is just,
And
yeah.
that's important to understand.
Yeah, it
I
is.
want to remind people mammals are meant to produce cholesterol. We're meant to.
Right. We need
And
to
for
have it.
some reason, we have been taught that it's an enemy.
Right. Right.
So,
I mean, you remember when they went through the whole don't eat egg yolks because it's got cholesterol and
sure,
it's so dangerous and da da da. And then years later, they reverse it and like, oh, it's fine. Don't eat too many, but it's fine.
exactly.
You know,
Well, we're
dietary
going to,
cholesterol does not increase cholesterol in that form, but
mm-hmm.
you know, it's
And
just it's yeah.
exactly. And that's where we're going to see a continuation of this.
Mm-hmm.
It'll
Mm-hmm.
move. My concern is I'm refreshed, or I should say, I'm refreshed to hear that there's a revisiting these situations. Who suffers in the meantime?
I know. I
Until
know.
that information gets out there, who is suffering? That's what
Right.
I care about.
Right.
So the individuals that are suffering because they're told to be on a statin drug for the rest of their lives, when indeed are there alternatives to this, number one?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
number two, what are the side effects or the results of taking these statin drugs? What
Right.
is the side
Right.
effect?
Right.
And that's
Because
what
I
my
yeah,
concern is.
I know because I don't think I mean they always have this what standard line that the benefits outweigh the side effect. You know, the risks outweigh the no, the benefits outweigh the risks of a drug that you're taking. But I think that's somewhat false, frankly. They will gloss over doctors. You know, that's who I mean by
Exactly.
they will just gloss over and or discount muscle pain or different, you know,
Mhm.
symptoms that people are feeling. But what their body is telling them is that you're interrupting my normal functioning to create this artificial reduction um,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
something that maybe doesn't even need to be reduced in the first place.
Mhm.
And if you do need
Exactly.
to reduce it, you know, ATP for one thing, or reducing sugar in your diet,
Mhm.
cleaning up your diet a bit, reducing processed food, you
Mhm.
know, not eating the standard American diet are
Mhm.
all ways in which you can improve your health, reduce your triglycerides.
Exactly. And I know that diet is challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah, I
And
know.
society, a venue, or you don't have to worry about changing your lifestyle. We'll just put you on a drug
I know.
that
I
basically will
know.
treat. Now, there are many drugs that are beneficial for us. I'm here not to trash drugs.
Right.
I'm
Right.
here to talk about use the right tool for the right situation.
Right.
That's
Right. And
all I'm talking about.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think we can't stress that enough that it is use the right tool for the right job.
Exactly.
And you know, there are alternatives to being on a statin drug, and long term, again, your health, you know, will thank you because
Exactly.
you will have a healthier body.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So, Danielle, that is the synopsis of why I wanted to
right.
generate this particular podcast. Is just to
Absolutely.
really allow people. This is meant to be a foundation or a venue for people to begin to think and be people to begin to open up and understand
Hmm.
there's more than just one dialogue or one mechanism in order to
Absolutely.
take care of a condition.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. And maybe you'll touch just for a minute on how our product ATP, just to refresh, if I know we covered this a little bit, but how does ATP help lower triglycerides as it was shown in the clinical studies that we did? How does that mechanism work? Is it
So,
that we're yeah,
mhm.
please go
So
ahead.
basically, increasing the number one, the oxidative rate of how we're able to increase the Krebs cycle activity, and
Mm-hmm.
increasing the Krebs cycle activity is what generates ATP, adenosine
Right,
triphosphate.
right.
Well, in order to do that, fuel is required.
Mm-hmm.
The first fuel is glucose,
Mm-hmm.
and if glucose is properly oxidized,
Mm-hmm.
then it appropriately produces 33 to 36 moles of ATP. Number one, glucose. Number two is the sugar that is stored within muscle and
Mm-hmm.
liver,
Mm.
glycogen. And glycogen is the second fuel source to really begin to generate ATP.
Mm.
The third source is going to be a fat.
Mm.
Guess what happens?
Mm.
This is where cholesterol, this is where triglycerides come into play.
Mm-hmm.
So, as indicated in the studies that we ran, basically it did exactly what we proposed it to do. As we increase the metabolic thirst for fuels, it's going to eventually want to get to fat. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where it's going to influence,
Mm.
lipoproteins, and it will
Mm-hmm.
influence triglycerides.
Okay. Mm. And tell me some of the components that are in ATP, because we always want to remind our customers and people watching this that even though our product is named ATP, it does not actually contain ATP, because you don't actually want to introduce external ATP into your body. You want to allow your body to create as much as it can in a safe fashion. So which ingredients are in our ATP that really help create this system, this increase in Krebs cycle activity?
Well, that's a question. It's almost, let me answer it with a question. What is the most important ingredient in a cake batter?
Well, yes,
Flour, eggs.
yes,
So, really, all of it together
yes,
synergizes the potential of what we're doing.
right,
So, ingredients such as nicotinic acid, not
yep,
niacinamide,
right,
riboflavin,
okay,
thiamine,
yep,
calcium pyruvate, those types of things,
okay,
coenzyme Q10, they all work synergistically together
perfect.
to increase the viable activity of the Krebs cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, then basically the thirst for these fuels, glucose,
Mm-hmm.
glycogen,
Mm-hmm.
fat stores, triglycerides, the
Mm.
topic of the subject today, and lipoproteins, is is up for grabs. And
Mm.
that's what we're doing. The
Okay.
more you have of these things, the better off we are, because we're providing more fuel for the Krebs cycle.
Yes, and one of the beautiful things about ATP is that you, according to your whatever your needs are, you can take more safely. And, you can start with the 1 cap twice a day. You can go to 2 caps twice a day. You can go to 3 caps 3 times a
Mm-hmm.
day if you want,
Mm-hmm.
depending on your energetic needs,
Mm-hmm.
to get that energy level.
Exactly. And Danielle, I want to revisit the question too to the viewers about, always remember that mammalian cells, basically, this HMG reductase is competitively suppressed, so it is controlled. What is that process that has lost our ability to suppress it competitively? And that has to do with the glucose. That,
Mm.
in part, or
Mm-hmm.
a large portion, the
Yeah.
higher the glucose, the higher the blood sugar, the higher
Mm-hmm.
the activity of insulin, not
Mm.
of glucagon, which is the
Right.
antagonist to insulin, but insulin itself,
Yeah.
means that we're going to have a higher response increasing HMG reductase. Because what will happen is it's sensitive to that insulin incline. And that's
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
thing to keep in mind. So, in an average situation, we as mammals competitively suppress, does that make sense? The HMG
Mm-hmm.
reductase.
Mm-hmm.
And it's controlled.
Mm-hmm.
There is a condition that we have to look at of why we're losing that suppression, or that competitive suppression.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, glucose just kind of wreaks havoc everywhere within the
Mm-hmm.
physiology, on so many levels. Um,
So,
and yeah.
yeah, if we look at it in a total format, we're looking at the more we abuse our bodies through dietary and
Mm-hmm.
what we put in our
Dietary
system.
abuse. Yep. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more we are going to require medications.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the more medications, instead of dealing with the causative factor, which would be what we're putting into our mouths, that includes ethanol, that includes alcohol. What
Mm-hmm.
we're doing is we're asking ourselves, and I will trade one thing for another thing. I will be able to continue to eat the way I eat.
I know. I know. And that's a
And
hard answer for a lot of people. But I
mm,
do, and I think some of that comes from the fact that highly processed foods are highly addictive. And I know that's a topic for another conversation, but it's an addiction
mm,
element to it, and food scientists design it that way.
mm,
And so the beautiful thing about that is that if you can escape that and lean more towards less processed food, that sort of addiction craving that you have to have that to be satisfied, that diminishes over time as your
mm,
body adapts to
mm.
to to a different kind of diet that doesn't contain that food science ingredients that make you want more and more.
Exactly. And we can look at it and say, well, it's just addictive. It's an addictive nature, which it is. But at what particular point in time are we going to say, we're going to ask ourselves, when can we put the addiction aside and
Hmm.
say we care about our bodies enough? We care
Right.
about our health enough
Right.
to
Right.
respect it, our bodies to respect it,
Absolutely.
and say,
Absolutely.
let's move ahead, let's move forward. And
Absolutely.
now I totally respect someone's desire to want to eat what they eat. I
Hmm.
totally respect, it's out of respect.
Yeah. I
But
mean, it's, yeah.
the thing that I find interesting is that then they complain.
I know.
If you're going
I
to
know.
do something, just enjoy it. If
Hmm.
you're going to gain 200 pounds, celebrate because you
Hmm.
deserve what you put into your body and you've
Right.
achieved what you've really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And that's to
Hmm.
gain weight.
Yeah.
And why
I
not
know.
celebrate? But
I know. I mean,
many people instead, when they gain 200 pounds, they feel frustrated. And I'm confused with this. They've worked to gain the weight. Now that they've gained the weight, they don't like it.
right.
It's fascinating to me how
They've
people think.
enjoyed the process by the foods that they're eating and the
Mhm,
lack of activity, and
mhm,
then they're dismayed that it's there. I mean,
exactly.
it's an interesting excuse me, it's an interesting dynamic because it's
Well, and
just
consequently, it affects many people. It affects the
hmm
taxpayer because guess who's paying for their medical care in people that have
absolutely
insurance rates and everything else. It
right.
really it breaks this unity of society and how we can help each other. And that's my
Oh,
personal opinion.
oh, for
Let's help
sure.
each other. When an individual is not taking care of their own health, basically they are, if they believe it or not, they are influencing their neighbor. And I think it's
Right.
important that we can
Yeah.
help each other out in this
Right.
process.
And
And
take care of ourselves the best
mhm.
way we can. And in the long run, I'm telling you, slightly more expensive food is way less expensive than drugs, poor health. I mean, and you can't stress that enough.
And
The
really good
poor health is
food,
expensive. Yeah.
exactly. And there's a misunderstanding that healthy food is really expensive. Nope, that's a
No, it
misconception.
doesn't have to be. No, you're right. You're right.
It's a misconception. Healthy food does not have to be expensive. It
No.
really doesn't. And
Mm-mm.
that's the premise of the
It
cooking
can
show.
be.
That's the premise
Right.
of the cooking show that we have
Right,
out.
right. I will say, and I say this because there are areas of the country where there is a disadvantage where they're in food deserts where the ability to actually get inexpensive, healthy food is in fact extremely difficult if you don't have a car, if you don't have a grocery store nearby. Excuse me, which happens, unfortunately. And so I think that there's that element, but that's again a whole other topic for another day. Generally speaking, healthy food does not have to be that expensive. It
Well,
might
no.
seem less interesting, but it doesn't have to be expensive.
So to your point, are how you doing? You okay?
Yeah, thanks.
To your point, dried beans last for years.
True. Very true.
Lentils,
Yep.
dried
Yep.
beans,
Yep.
you know, last for years. Whole grains stored
Right.
can
Right.
last a long time.
Right.
You can live in an area that is more challenging
Mm-hmm.
to get fresh food, and I've experienced this personally in Asia when I was
Yeah.
over there. You can get these foods and still eat healthy, even though
Mm-hmm.
you may not
It's
have
yeah.
uh, the amount of vegetables you might want or fresh fruits or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Still, you
No,
can
it's
have
true.
the availability of getting dried beans. In
Yeah.
other words, my translation here is, how many excuses do we have as humans
Mm-hmm.
to come up
Mm-hmm.
with the reason why we eat junk food?
I
And
know.
you know what? Just instead of an excuse, just say you like junk food. Just say, I
But then
like it and I know what
but
it's
then
going
to
to
your
do.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but then to your point earlier, then don't complain about it when your health
Exactly.
suffers from it. And
Exactly.
don't expect government help to take care of your health care bill because you're
Exactly.
choosing to eat that way.
Exactly. And a
No,
lot of
it's true.
people, in my personal opinion, cover it up with other, it's shuttled and diverted into other mechanisms, such as, you know, I exercise, so I should be okay. I engage
Yeah.
in yoga, so I should be okay. I meditate,
Yeah.
so I should be okay. All of these
No.
diversions that
Mm-hmm.
give them a reason why, I do this, therefore I can eat this. Instead of making all these up, just say, hey, listen, you like Hostess Twinkies. Just admit
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
just, you know what? We'll buy you cases of it if you want to. Who cares? It's just as long as you understand
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
outcome is. And I
Yeah.
think many people do understand what the outcome is. The same thing applies to the use of a drug, like a statin drug.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what the outcome will be. You should.
Well, you should. But the interesting thing too, I think, is that the process perhaps of eating poorly is you have that instant gratification, but you don't have, to some degree, it depends, but you don't have that instant effect, negative effect. It's an accumulative thing. And so people say they kind of kick it down the road, like, oh, well, I'll start eating healthier as I get older, or
Sure.
or I feel fine, so I'm sure I'm not being affected by it. But the
Mm-hmm.
fact of the matter is, all of this stuff happens over time. You're eating
Mm-hmm.
thousands of meals in your lifetime, and so you can't assume that it's not going to have a cumulative effect, because it does. But
Exactly.
it's hard for people to grasp that for sure.
The same thing with fiscal stability. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of people, I think, they get older and they say, that's okay, I'll save when I'm 40. Okay, then no,
Right.
that's okay. I'll save when I'm 50. And pretty
Right.
soon they're 60 and they
And they're
don't
like,
have
well,
anything.
crap, I didn't start. Yeah,
And the
exactly.
amount of time they have has
Mm-hmm.
reduced rather than
Yeah.
if they were 20 years old.
Right.
It's the
Right.
same type of thing. Well, I'll clean up my act. I'll stop drinking when I'm 40. I'll stop drinking when I'm 50.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start.
Mm-hmm.
You're losing time. It's
Right.
cumulative.
Right.
And the
Exactly.
accumulation means that, and it's no surprise to any of us why we see the incidence of pathologies rising with younger ages,
I know.
in America at
Right.
least.
Yeah.
What is happening here?
Oh, for sure. You're
What
seeing
is.
It's crazy. You're seeing younger instances of stroke, of heart attacks, of colon cancer, of all
Mm,
types of cancer.
mm,
And people wonder why that's happening. Well, I can tell you why that's happening. I mean,
mm.
it doesn't take a rocket scientist by any means. So,
And always to shuttle the blame to something else.
mm-hmm,
That's the
mm-hmm,
typical thing, is
mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm,
say, okay, it wasn't my fault. This just happened or whatever.
mm-hmm.
There
Right.
has to be some accountability.
There does. There absolutely does. No, it's
So,
absolutely true. Yeah.
and it's not, I'm not here to, I'm here to respect everyone and what everyone does,
Mm-hmm,
you know,
mm-hmm.
as long as it doesn't do harm to others. I respect that. If you want to eat whatever, go to
Right.
town.
Right.
It's just when you get to the point of where it catches up with you, why complain about it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
That's
mm-hmm,
my point.
mm-hmm. I know. And why pick solutions that are adding other health problems to your
Exactly.
body? It's not the right fix,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know. Yeah,
So, as a summary, as we wrap things up here,
sure.
it's important to understand, number one, the various types of lipoproteins are not as catastrophic of what people are thinking they are.
Okay.
Triglycerides,
That's the
they
number to look at.
that
Yep.
is catastrophic.
Yeah.
The higher the triglycerides, the
Yeah.
more detrimental things can be. The
Okay.
higher the consumption of calcium can be
Mm.
catastrophic to
Okay.
cardiovascular problems,
Yep. Yep.
as I've touched on before.
Yeah.
Understanding that lipoproteins, even though they do contribute, I don't want to say they're completely innocent here. They're not, they shouldn't be tagged like they are.
Yeah.
Cholesterol shouldn't be tagged as a negative as the way
Right.
it is, even
Right.
though it does have a contributing factor. I want to make sure that's clear. But
Right.
the question I
It's
have,
not the whole culprit there. No.
exactly, the question I
Mm-hmm.
have for viewers is, what is the outcome by taking an inhibitor, an HMG
Mm-hmm.
inhibitor? What
Mm-hmm.
is the outcome by shutting down our cholesterol production?
Right.
That's the question I
Right.
have for
Right.
everyone.
Right. I know. Absolutely. What is the outcome? Or yeah, I know. Are you aware of the outcome? Not you personally, but whoever's taking the statin drug, for sure. Well, I think that's a great conclusion. And
Okay.
I think we're just about out of time today. So
Yep.
thank you, Kevin. This has been great. If you have questions or comments, leave them below. And we'll see you on another day.
Great. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.